you.
Good morning. Good morning. I just like to tender apology for Chairperson Bartman. And in the absence of a chairperson, as per Standing Rule 82.3, the committee would have to appoint and nominate and appoint a chairperson. So I would like to take nominations now. Member Philander and Member Wenger.
Good morning. I wish to propose Member Mackenzie.
Member Wenger.
Thank you. I'd like to second the proposal.
Thank you, Member. No further nominations. Member Mackenzie, I see you in your seat.
Thank you very much. That was a surprise. Good morning, colleagues. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you, Chair.
Thank you, colleagues. Welcome. My name is Ricardo Mackenzie. I'm the acting chairperson. First of all, let me put apology for our chairperson. She's not with us today, and she will be back with us soon. Colleagues, I'm not going to ask all of you to introduce yourself, but there's quite a lot of you on this meeting. Looks like 30 people. So I'm just welcoming you. Welcome this morning on this hybrid sitting of the Budget Committee, which normally takes place after the Provincial Economic Review. You all have received the agenda for this meeting. So I'm just going to ask all colleagues, please remember to mute yourself and switch off your camera until such time as it's your turn to speak. Point of order, please do it in the chat function or MS Teams. And then once you finish speaking, please switch off your mics. As you all know by now, all the rules of the standing rules of Parliament applies also on virtual meetings. I'm not going to go through all the rules. We've been doing this for 20 months. So by now, everybody's aware of it. Without further ado, I'm going to hand over to the Minister and his team just to take us through the Provincial Economic Review and Outlook. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for the opportunity to appear before the committee. I think I have in my speech outlined the main points in the 2021 Provincial Economic Review and Outlook. And through you, I'd like to hand to the team to take us through the presentation, which will no doubt present sort of further particulars, because as you know, it is a very long and very detailed, and I hope very useful document to members of this committee and to members of the Provincial Parliament. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. Thank you, Chair. Yes, we're going to, I think, present slightly more detail on the Provincial Economic Review and Outlook to the committee now. I will leave the bulk of that to the team and really just make 2 points that I think might be useful for the committee at this point. The first is, of course, a firm belief and approach in the Provincial Treasury that the data and the evidence matter in how we approach public policy and budget choices in the province. And now more than ever, obviously, in these very uncertain times and extraordinary times, we need to make sure that we are looking broadly at the data and the evidence. And I'm very pleased and grateful to the Treasury team for the hard work that they've done in looking for new sources of data and evidence at a subnational level that helps us to reflect on the situation and the dynamics of our context in the Western Cape in particular. And the second point that I would make is that I think the committee is already aware that we are innovating somewhat this year in how we present our economic reviews and outlooks. Now, typically in the past, we've presented both the provincial and the municipal economic review and outlook together. This year, in the context of also local government elections and new incoming municipal leadership, who we think are a key audience for this work, we have split the two publication dates apart. So we will be coming back to the committee and to the legislature in November around the municipal review and outlook, which will allow us, I think, to not lose the value of the municipal insights in the overall provincial outlook, because I think previously it was quite an overwhelming amount of data to process across 2 large and rich documents. So as always, with the economic reviews and outlook, we really value feedback from the committee. We really value insights that they may also be getting from the data, from the evidence that we have available. And we are always looking, as I think we're showing again this year, in how we can continue to improve what we regard as a really critical contribution from the Provincial Treasury and our colleagues in other departments who we work closely with. Towards policy making in the province. So with that, let me hand over to Dr. Haverman and the team to take the committee through some of the detail. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chair, and good morning to the committee. So I think the theme of the PERA is, as the Minister outlined, there really is a need now for us to ramp up vaccination rates, and as the Minister outlined, a deep need to move to lower lockdowns and to, in a way, become ready to reopen and recover. So on the following slide, we just outline sort of the key issues happening in the province at the moment, and this data is from 19th of September, and obviously a slightly more recent updated data takes the vaccination rates to 39%. But essentially, the Western Cape is leading from a vaccination rates perspective. And after a long and disruptive COVID-19, how people are moving around the province, and it uses different sort of, it triangulates your phone and where you are, and it overlaps to see how much people are using different facilities. And it shows quite a strong trend towards more and more mobility in the province, which obviously is really, really good in terms of moving towards reopening and recovering trajectory. The big concern, of course, is that if we don't vaccinate fast enough, and if we don't put down the resources for vaccination, then that can also work against us. So it really is a story about having to now move to a post-vaccination world. On the following slide, however, we do highlight the fact that there are still a number of risks. The South African Western Cape economy is obviously on a recovery path to make up for lost ground in economic growth, in employment and inequality, but the extent of the recovery is uncertain. One of the big uncertainties is the speed at which the vaccination drive can take place. There's also a lot of uncertainty about the potential for further waves of COVID. We have seen in the past that if we don't do the right things at the right time, then there can be another wave. And so nationally, the extent of vaccination coverage is very important. But there are still deep underlying structural challenges in the South African economy. The most obvious is the electricity constraint and the fact that we do need to rapidly improve the supply of electricity. And as the Minister alluded to in the speech, and as we as a province have been driving, we do have a strategy to unblock electricity in the province by improving municipal energy resilience and also making the Western Cape ready for a growth trajectory. Then, of course, there's a constrained fiscal environment and growing population, which will limit the extent to which government can contribute to the recovery and deliver services. Unemployment remains a deep challenge, and we go into quite a lot of detail in the PERA about the unemployment challenge, particularly nationally and provincially. And we have some ideas about how flexible labor markets could improve employment growth. And then there has been an uptick in crime, but we'll go into a little bit of detail about this in this last quarter. And that's after a very long downward trend in crime. And that really also links to the problem that the significant contraction in the economy has naturally also had these socioeconomic implications, also outlined in the speech. So just to turn to the global macroeconomic performance and output, after last year's global recession, there's a gradual and uneven recovery expected. The chapter in the PERA goes into quite a lot of detail, highlighting the fact that certain countries are expecting a much faster recovery than other countries. This is very closely related to the speed at which they are able to vaccinate their populations, and also the speed at which they're obviously, as a result, able to open up. And there is, to some extent, some inequality developing in the ability of countries to reopen. Also just re-emphasizing the importance of vaccinations as a center point for recovering from the pandemic. Advanced economies are all seeing a bounce back. That emerging and developing economies number might seem quite large, but in historical context, that is actually a lot slower than these countries have generally been growing in the past. And that is naturally because the COVID recovery has been slower in certain of the emerging and developing economies, largely because they have been quite significantly affected by the downturn. Why this is important for us is because for the Western Cape, we rely heavily on these large advanced economies for our exports. We obviously export a lot of goods to the United States and to Europe, and that's very important for our economic growth. On the following slide, we do an outlook per sector. Naturally, the big hits to the economy were in construction. You see minus 21% there as construction almost completely ground to a halt. Wholesale and retail trade, the one below that, that's all catering and accommodation. And if you overlay that with the Google mobility data that I showed before, where we showed retail trade and people visiting retail venues, you can see that there's been almost a huge collapse in that sector. Perfectly understandable, considering the fact that the Western Cape obviously relies heavily on tourism. And if you link that to the economic forecast, it obviously shows that the Western Cape will probably still grow slower than the rest of the country this year, and that's because tourism has been very hard hit. On the plus side, however, we've had a remarkably good agricultural year, and that's as a result of a very good harvest. That has been tempered to some extent by some of the restrictions on alcohol sales, which has also hurt exports. But going forward, we do expect that agriculture may have a reasonably good average projection over the next 2 or 3 years. That's obviously very important for the Western Cape, not only from an output perspective, but also from an employment perspective, because a lot of people rely on agriculture, particularly for short-term jobs. On the following slide, we just outline the employment trends across different ages, socioeconomic groups, and education groups. As is usually often the case, if you look at the bottom, the growth in employment amongst the people with education has been rising. Older people employment is rising, but there has been huge losses in the youth, male and colored individuals. And that really reflects the extent to which different groups are affected by different parts of the economy, and this huge collapse in retail and as a result of the lockdown, which has deepened the crisis, particularly in youth unemployment. That said, the Western Cape unemployment rate has gone up lower than the rest of the country, suggesting that our labor force has been slightly more resilient. And then on the following slide, we talk a little bit more to the employment growth per sector. And there again, there are lots of different colors, but there again, the trends are clear in terms of which sectors have been most heavily affected as a result of the lockdown, particularly during this period. On the following slide, really interesting statistic about employment growth compared to the rest of the country. And as I said earlier, the Western Cape employment has been growing faster than the rest of the country. One of the reasons for this might be that productivity, one measure of this is real wages per worker, has been rising, which is good for workers, but has been rising at a slower rate than the rest of the country, suggesting that we have been able to be relatively more productive. It also reflects the slightly faster growth rate in the Western Cape economy over the last decade. But just highlighting there that although there has been this fall in unemployment in both the Western Cape and South Africa, the fall has been a sort of a relatively better news, better in the Western Cape. Following slide. This is this interesting graph about Western Cape agricultural exports. And I'm going to hand over to Malcolm to talk us through the performance by sector, starting with agriculture.
Thank you, Roy. So this slide speaks to the cumulative growth of exports for the agricultural sector and the rest of the Western Cape between 2011 and 2020. So agricultural exports can be hailed as a major success story. The significance of the agricultural sector to the rest of exports in the Western Cape has increased over the past 10 years. It grew by a massive 117% between 2011 and 2020, relative to a contraction of 6% by the rest of Western Cape exports. The Western Cape agricultural exports have been fueled by a depreciating currency and focus to high-value exports products such as fruit and berries. Agricultural sector's exports growth surpassed that of the total exports by the Western Cape in 2017, and in 2020, the contribution of the agricultural exports to that of the total Western Cape exports was 30.9%. So the Western Cape.
College, can you mute yourself, please?
Can I proceed?
Yeah.
The Western Cape's agricultural and agri-processing sector accounted for more than 50% of the national agricultural exports in value terms. And in terms of some of the major significant contributions of the total exports for specific commodities, the Western Cape exports was 95.6% of bottled wine, 96.1% of pears, 98.1% of blueberries, and 96.1% for bulk wine. Next slide. So, as pointed out in the first slide, unemployment is a huge challenge for South Africa and the Western Cape. The informal sector plays an important role in absorbing the relatively low-skilled workforce in employment and making the labor force more flexible towards employers and entrepreneurs. The informal sector made a notable contribution to the total unemployment in the Western Cape at 11.5%, and South Africa at 17.6%. Since the second quarter of 2020, the informal sector gained back 53.2%, as opposed to 34.5% of the informal sector's employment. The flexible nature of the informal sector in terms of employment is due to its buoyancy in the recovering from the employment setback that commenced in the second quarter in 2020 by recovering at a much faster rate than the formal sector. Next slide. So the slide speaks to migration into the Western Cape. Migration is a natural phenomenon as people search in terms of employment opportunities and other opportunities. So nationally, for the period 2016 to 2021, an estimate net migration of 852,992 were recorded. Between 2016 and 2021, it is expected that the Western Cape will experience a net inflow of migrants of about 292,522 people, with the majority from the Eastern Cape and the Gauteng. So it can be expected that as the population increases, there will be an increased need for economic opportunities and government services, such as health, education, and other social services. Taking the population dynamics into consideration is important for government when considering policies to address major societal challenges such as poverty, inequality, and human development. Next slide. So this slide speaks to inequality measured by the Gini coefficient. So in terms of the number, if you're closer to 1, you are worse off. So it can be expected with increased unemployment levels, inequality increase. So the most vulnerable are those with lower levels of educational attainment. It is notable that the Gini coefficient for all districts in the Western Cape is lower than that of the rest of the country. In 2020, the Central Karoo district had the lowest Gini coefficient, and the West Coast the second lowest in the province. Rising inequality can be associated with increased social unrest and citizen frustration, which can further hinder economic development. Next slide. This slide speaks to the Human Development Index, and in this regard, you're closer to 1, the better off you are. So considering that HDI is a composite index, it's made up of measures such as life expectancy, literacy, and income. The marginal decrease in the HDI ranking can be attributed to a slight decrease in gross domestic national income per capita. The Western Cape and South Africa continues to make progress in the HDI, and the progress is linked to improved education outcomes and life expectancy. Improvements in the HDI in the Western Cape show that the metro and the districts have improved between 2012 and 2020. Also notable is that the Western Cape's HDI of 0.769 is well above the world average. Next slide. So this slide speaks to the top 10 leading unnatural causes of death. Natural causes of death amongst women and men in 2018 in the Western Cape. So the Western Cape had the highest number of non-communicable diseases compared to other provinces, with 8 out of the 10 being non-communicable diseases like hypertension, diabetes, cardiovascular diseases, and obesity. There's obviously slight differences between men and women. The leading underlying natural cause for death for men was ischemic heart disease, followed by deep diabetes and tuberculosis. And for women, the leading underlying natural cause of death was diabetes, followed by cerebrovascular disease and HIV. A healthy lifestyle can lower the risk of diseases and will obviously mean a lower burden on the health system. Next slide. This slide speaks to the underlying non-natural causes of death for the Western Cape. The highest contributor of non-natural diseases was accidental injuries at almost 70%, followed by assault at 20% and transport-related accidents at 5.8%. Now I'm going to hand over to my colleague, Taryn van der Rede, who's going to present online. Thank you.
Thank you, Malcolm. So for the Western Cape, life expectancy has really progressively improved over time. Between 2001 and 2006, you will see that for males, life expectancy stood at 59.2 years compared to females at 63.7. This has improved to 64.9 for males and 70.3 for females between 2016 and 2021. These statistics are largely attributed to the fact that we have an improvement in our ability to deal with the burden of disease, but also starts to put up a new risk in terms of an aging population, which places different challenges on our entire health system, but also on the economy. Next slide. So according to the NIDS-CRAM study, the COVID pandemic has really had a profound effect on mental health wellness. It's also more prevalent amongst male workers, and also 72.2% among 18 to 35-year-olds have experienced depressive symptoms. So since we've really received this data on mental health, it's really become at the forefront of our policy discussions within the Western Cape, and will also feature quite prominently in our MTBPS to be tabled in November of this year. Next slide. Another interesting statistic is access to the internet by province. For the Western Cape, 74.3% of those who live in the Western Cape have access to the internet. So this, for example, could be within work, schools, or hotspots, as well as internet cafes. And this is compared to 63.3% anywhere else in the Western Cape, as well as South Africa. And then in terms of the Western Cape specifically, with access to internet at home, that stands at 21.7% compared to 9.1% for the national average. This is also an important statistic because it does really showcase the access to information, access to work opportunities, as well as access to social networks, but also gives you an indication of the digital divide in the country. Next slide. Then, as spoken to by Dr. Haberman, this slide just provides you with an overview of the vaccination rates. So for the adult population, 36.6% of our population within the province has been vaccinated. This is compared to 29.1% in terms of the national average. And as previously stated, this really highlights the opportunity for our economy to reopen, but also for us to increase our economic activity in the province. Next slide. And then this slide just provides you with an overview of the crimes committed. As previously stated, there has been a steady decline in crimes committed since 2017-18, with a specific decline during the lockdown regulations. But since these lockdown regulations have really been relaxed, you'll see that there has been quite an increase, particularly in terms of sexual offences. These statistics also highlight the importance of us as a Western Cape to continue really implementing our Western Cape Recovery Plan, particularly the priority around safety. And then in terms of the final slide, this just looks at the summary of the pedo implications. So here we're highlighting the importance of population size and growth in terms of the impact on service delivery demands. So really how the population size has increased the demand for government services, particularly frontline government services, such as health, education, and public infrastructure. We've also highlighted the fact that the economic contraction has really had a great impact on our government sector, and here really highlighting the importance of us having to think differently about how we deliver services within government, particularly given our constrained fiscal environment. We've also previously highlighted the fact that the unemployment rate has continued to rise, reaching an all-time high of 34.4% in the second quarter of 2021. This is really predominantly around the youth, which accounts for 2/3 of the unemployment, and therefore also emphasizing the importance of us having to have a youth policy response being put in place. As previously stated, is also the fact that the informal employment absorbs relatively more Africans, coloureds populations, men, youth, as well as the less educated individuals. And here emphasizing the point that we really need to look at how we start stimulating the informal economy, but also looking at how we can apply less stringent labour legislation in order to support business development. And then lastly, the 2020 recession resulted in increased poverty and inequality in the Western Cape, which requires an integrated and transversal approach. This transversal approach needs to be taken across the spheres of government, but also looking at how we better partnership with the private sector, civil society, as well as our communities. Thank you, Chairperson.
Great. Thank you very much, Chairperson. That concludes the presentation. Of course, the document itself has a lot of considerably more data and analysis, but we'd be happy to take any questions and clarifications at this stage. I know that members of the committee will still need time to study the document in more detail.
Very much, colleagues. Can I see hands for questions? You'll have to see the documentation via email, or the hard copy will be given to you as well. So the more technical detail we'll obviously go through, but if there's any hands for general questions, I'll take those. While you go through your notes, that's when you ask my questions, because I see there's no hands as yet. Minister, can I ask from you and also from your departments? You've now done the research, you're doing your midterm budget policy statement coming up in a few weeks. How is this information going to influence that midterm statement? And then my second question would be on the small businesses, the tourist businesses, the agriculture businesses that has been severely affected. Agriculture, we know this, not selling of alcohol, closing of selling of alcohol. Will this information, has some of the information influence how Treasury support these businesses? And the world economy is going to grow by 6%. We're talking about 3.2% in South Africa. What needs to change for us to try to get to that level over the next year? And how will you as Treasury going to work with departments to ensure that they restructure their budgets to contribute to additional growth? And my fourth question is on the mental health, as stated there on one of the slides, the third last slide. Has Treasury worked with the relevant departments to make additional funding available, or to look at their own funding, perhaps? Because everybody wants more money. To look at their own funding and how they can support not only the 80,000 staff in the Western Cape, but whatever business that you support in the Western Cape, the tourism business, and in terms of dealing with mental health. So, because we know when more people are at work, more people are sick, they can't get to work, ultimately it will affect us. And then my last question will be on your actual speech, Minister. On the 5 points that you raised, on the first point, the UK must remove South Africa from the red list. From the Western Cape government perspective, what have you done? Have you met with the UK ambassador or the thing they call the High Commissioner? Have a discussion around what needs to happen for the UK to remove us? And then on the second point is to remove Cyril Ramaphosa must move up to level 1. As that discussion is taking place, I know there's a PCC coming soon. What is the status on that? And the third point that you raised about the connectivity issue, the stumbling blocks in the tourism sector. One of the points in your speech, you says the increased connectivity, the Minister Mbalula must sort of the application status on Delta. Have you had discussion, or the Minister of Transport, Minister Mitchell, had a discussion taking place, and where is that discussion? Because that will obviously help us in improving our tourism opportunities. Similarly with Minister Motsoaledi regarding the remote working visas. The fourth point, we know what's happening with vaccines, all of us at some level are involved in our constituency. And then the last point on the national state of disaster as well, also where's that? And just going backwards on those 5 points, if that does not happen, how will it impact economic growth in the Western Cape? That's my questions. I see there's some hands up. Member Nkondlo. Member Nkondlo. Member America.
Thank you, Chair. I have one question, and the question is whether there is a causal link between the inward migration of people into the Western Cape and the rising inequality that we witness across our various districts. And if it is so, will it impact upon our various municipalities in its ability to render services to often indigent residents within those municipalities? And then lastly, whether the inward migration, which often is represented by indigent individuals, whether there will be a case to be made for the equitable share to be reconsidered in terms of what is allocated to the Western Cape. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Member Nkondlo. Are you with us? Member Nkondlo can't hear us. Member Nkondlo, can you hear us?
Yes, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Okay, I can hear you now. You can continue.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, Chair. Thank you for the presentation. Can I start, Chair, by getting clarity about this rationale of not releasing the MERO and specifics on when in November will such a report be brought to Parliament? Because for me, I think it is very funny that on the local government election year, a decision, and I'm not sure how that decision, and if it was communicated to the committee, because there's an expectation of the PERO and the MERO as two reports that would normally be brought together, with particular reference to the fact that the MERO would then give better clarity in as far as the provincial economy is concerned, into its links to the regional economies. So I'm interested to understand this rationale, and hopefully it's not a political rationale because there's local government election, and why the report will only be presented after the local government elections. The second question, Chair, I have here is that I'm interested to understand when the department speaks about the reopening of the economy, given the indication that we are at 36.6 vaccinated persons in terms of the population size in the Western Cape, what then becomes a scientific measure, or what are those conditions, and hopefully they can be indicated what determines those, that says the economy can be open at this level or that other level. Can we get some kind of a clarity of what that means? Should a province or a country be at this sort of percentage of vaccinations? What are the other things? I would be interested just to understand what is the measure, whether it's a measure from the WHO or anything to indicate such.
Good seeing you, eh? Let's watch there. Yeah, we borrow the car.
Yeah, my third one, Chair. I think the issue of the youth that is being raised, and the department in the presentation speaks about a youth policy response. And one question in that is to understand, in as far as the growing sectors which have been mentioned, like your BPO, green economy, and the likes, do we have clear data that will indicate the extent to which these, in their numbers, have actually sort of created jobs for youth versus the numbers of young people that are unemployed? Is there any way we can be able to do that kind of a comparison in terms of the number of jobs created per these growing sectors versus the actual youth unemployment? And also to say, with the department, with that youth policy response, is there a youth policy in the Western Cape as we speak? As I understand that there has always been a national youth policy in the country. So I'm interested to understand whether that articulation of that youth policy is the one in the Western Cape, because indeed I would agree with the department to say there is a need of a youth policy response, because there is no way a youth unemployment situation can actually just be placed under the goodwill or what happens in the market. It needs to be a dedicated thing, because the current challenges of youth unemployment are bigger, and they've got other spin-offs in other areas. So I'm interested in that. And then in this question of the informal sector having recovered much faster than the formal economy, and the informal sector once again proved to actually be where your Black communities more are active in. Once again, is there a strategy in the province that responds to informal sectors? And I'm sure this has been a conversation that we've been raising. One, whether you talk about township revitalization or whatever, I'm interested to know, is there a response when there is data that is proving, as it has been said by the department, that the informal sector is recovering much faster than the formal sector, and it's where majority of those that are from the Black communities, which are mostly, not necessarily part of the formal sector participating. So how is this sort of harnessed by the provincial government from this particular pero, so that you give more meaning to it? My last one, Chair, is on the Gini coefficient. I'm interested because I think the speaker or the presenter spoke about looking at the Gini coefficient versus also the Human Development Index. Is there any particular relationship that can be drawn from the Gini coefficient index and the HDI? And I'm raising this because whilst it is not, because we still have to go through the report, if one looks at what was presented in terms of that diagram, you would see from 2016 to where we are in terms of this pero, the Gini coefficient is actually closer to 1, which by standards of inequality, that is very high. Whilst it is said that human HDI on the other side is 0.69, which indicates a better state. So I'm interested to understand this relationship, and the relationship in particular, that one in the Mero used to be clarified very well when it comes to how this gets to be explained, in the diversified or in the individualized regional economies. I'm going to stop there for now, Chair. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I forgot to ask one more question, colleagues. Just one on the cyber attack that police operations in Cape Town. If we could just get what was the feedback from our colleagues at Transnet, and how are they going to prevent that from happening again? Thank you.
Chair, can you request member Regan to close his video? He's smoking us now into this meeting.
Thank you. Colleagues, you can continue.
Respond?
Yeah, you can continue. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. I'm going to hand to the department and then I will come back at the end.
Thank you. Thank you, Minister. Thank you, Chair, and thanks to the members for a very rich set of questions. I'll try and address them all in turn, and obviously call on my colleagues to assist on a few of them. The Chair, you started out asking the relationship between the MTBPS, the Pero and the MTBPS. There's in fact a very straight line between them, certainly in how we sequence the budget process. This the Pero helps us to understand the shape and dynamics of the provincial economy and its outlook. The MTBPS is when the policy, the budget policy adjustments that are proposed for the next medium-term expenditure cycle are tabled. What happens in between the tabling of this document is and the minister tabling the MTBPS is a series of discussions that at a technical level and at a political level in the executive, of course, that look at the responses of each of the votes, each of the departments of government across a broad array of policy issues that are effectively raised in the Pero itself. So there is a very step-bound process that we go through each year, and the Pero is, I think it would be appropriate to say, is the first public manifestation of the start of the budget process that will then conclude in March next year. So there's a lot of time available, a lot of hard work to be done, but a lot of time available to digest in detail the data and analysis that is presented here, and make sure that government, the public policy responses to this are appropriate and assigned appropriately across the departments of the provincial government. You asked, Chair, as well, whether there was support to businesses that are struggling in the source of the lockdown. There are a number of programs. The Department of Economic Development and Tourism, in particular, has a number of very active programs that have been supporting businesses to respond, but also to access national schemes that have provided various forms of financial and non-financial support to businesses to sustain operations and to sustain jobs. More directly, when it comes to the operations of the provincial government, I think certainly the minister and I think the entire executive has been clear when it comes to administered prices that are determined by the provincial government and may have an effect on businesses in certain sectors. There have been concerted efforts to keep price increases as low as is possible across the board, whether that be liquor licensing fees or other administered prices. I think alongside that there are ongoing efforts to really ease doing business, reduce red tape, which also imposes costs on business who need to transact either with the provincial government or to be or in the course of doing business to receive certain approvals or permitting from the provincial government. One of those, which I think the Department of Transport and Public Works would be better placed and may well have briefed the relevant committee on already, is around heavy vehicle permitting in the province, which is a key part of our freight logistics system, and extensive efforts they've made in that regard to make the transit of goods and abnormal loads much easier in the province, and that's some quite exciting work, actually. The question of what structural changes in the global economy, I'm going to defer on that one to my colleague, Dr. Haverman, who I'm sure could write his second PhD on that topic, and so I won't spoil the surprise there. Other than to say on your question of health, mental health in particular. The questions of mental health, and members would probably be aware of the results of the NIDS-CRAM survey, which indicated real mental health concerns across the population of South Africa as a whole, and unsurprising, but nonetheless deeply concerning. I can certainly confirm that this is an issue that both the executive and the administration are seized with, well beyond just the welfare of staff. Although there are real concerns over the welfare, particularly of frontline staff. That are always going to be a concern for the Western Cape government as an employer. But more broadly, for the population as a whole, there are discussions underway. It is not, and I think that the appropriate policy fine-tuning to be able to provide the appropriate response is what the budget process itself will deliver. It is not absolutely clear that the primary requirement is additional resourcing in a cash sense. That's not always the right way to, not every problem requires a fiscal response. It can be a tailoring of programs in order to meet a more immediate set of needs and concerns. But certainly that's a matter that is being actively considered at a very high level in the provincial government, and I know that it's a matter of discussion in the executive as well. I will ask. I'm sure the minister will come back on the questions that you posed to him in particular. So and I think he would possibly be better placed to deal with the issue of the cyber attacks that you raised, Chair, given his other portfolio. Other than to say that, of course, we're all aware of the absolutely central role that the Port of Cape Town plays in the overall logistics architecture of the Western Cape economy, and so I think we saw vulnerabilities there, and certainly Western Cape government partnership in that regard is with the Port of Cape Town is essential. Honourable America, you asked the question of the causal link between in-migration and inequality. I don't think that there is an absolutely necessary link between the two, but clearly people do migrate in a developing world context. They will move to places where there's opportunity, and that happens all over the world. The question of whether that results in increased inequality or increases in poverty, and whether that is, which are two different things, and whether that is sustained over time, I think that the evidence is mixed. Clearly, from a public policy perspective, in the Western Cape, we want to make sure that in migration, the arrival of migrants in the province is actually an opportunity for the province in terms of being able to create growth potential, to expand the growth potential of the province. And that's a trend that's been seen globally. Migrants are often ambitious, committed individuals or families who really are taking risks to make to really seize opportunities before them, and can often become drivers of economic growth. Migrants also tend to arrive in our context on different bases, either on a seasonal basis, particularly related to our agricultural sector, or more structurally, or there are patterns also of circular migration. So it's important to understand the different sorts of migrants that might come and where they might locate. These are trends that will be further unpacked in the municipal economic review and outlook, because it's very important that at the municipal level you don't assume that there's a single pattern of migration that is underway in the province, and ensuring that it is managed productively and in a growth enhancing way needs to respond to the actual underlying dynamics of the migration that's in place in the first place. The equitable share, Honourable America, you asked the question as well, does it adjust? The equitable share does adjust to population movement. It adjusts to the trend of population movement, both at the local government level through the local government equitable share and at the provincial level through the provincial equitable share. There is, however, an inevitable lag effect between when people move and when the measurement takes place that provides the evidence that that movement has occurred. I'm reminded of the former statistician general who used to laugh and say there are lies, damn lies, and statistics, which is a famous quote. I think it's somewhat unfair, but but statistics really represent a hopefully just recent past. And then the fiscal system needs to use that evidence to then catch up as well. So that's the lag effect. And we do struggle with that in the Western Cape because we are a growing province. Gauteng also struggles with that, and I think the more urban centres at the local government level across the country struggle with those lag effects. But I think they're relatively well understood, and ultimately the adjustments are being made structurally in the design of the formula and the deployment of the formulas, distribution formulas, and so forth. Member Nkondlo, you concerned that the MERO is not published together with the PERO. We see this. We did advise the House of this. It's absolutely not political from our perspective. The key for us is how do we use evidence for planning and budgeting. And we need to make sure that the deployment of the evidence and our consideration and digestion of the evidence happens at the right time in the budget cycle. So for the province, we table this at the start of our budget process, and it concludes in March. Municipalities have a different financial year to us. It's a quarter removed. And so their budget process only begins actually quite a bit later. What we've been doing is we've been tabling information from at the municipal level too early for them, and therefore the data itself even is a little bit outdated by the time they're starting their budget process. So I think this actually improves the system in terms of the planning and budgeting cycle in government. I think it also it also avoids drowning the system in too much data in a single large omnibus tabling. In other words, it really loses, I think, some of the richness and detail that is in the municipal level perspectives. We will be able to, when we table, I recall, I don't have the date exactly in front of me, I think it is the 30th of November, the tabling is that we will be able to provide updated data, including updated at the provincial level when we give an update on the overall provincial economics. So I think that provincial economy in order to pull the district perspectives from that. So I think it will actually add to the richness of debate and fact-led, evidence-led debate for the province, and it'll improve the quality of planning and budgeting across the province as well, including for local governments. I think there's an advantage that we're making sure that the decision makers, as recently elected in the forthcoming elections, will have fresh data available to them at the start of their terms of office, rather than what would be given. I'm sure that their activities on the hustings will probably distract them from being able to adequately read those documents at this point. So I can absolutely assure you that this is a technical decision. It's got absolutely nothing to do with the politics, but it's got the current political environment, but has got everything to do with our commitment to strengthen evidence-based planning and budgeting in the province going forward. You did ask, Honourable Nkondlo, what vaccination rates would allow the economy to reopen. Now, I'm not a public health specialist. I think that leads us to a debate around herd immunity. And I'm not qualified to speak on that topic. I do think that our colleagues in the Department of Health are eminently qualified to speak on this topic, and I've heard them speak on the topic, and it is not a simple answer with respect. There's no one answer when it comes to what are adequate levels of vaccination. There are a range of complex variables that come into play in understanding that concept, including issues such as the shape and form of the virus itself. So I won't venture into that world. I would just point, which I think is just another perspective that I'll add here, in terms of what is achievable in the Western Cape. And I would point to the data in Chapter 5 on vaccination levels in terms of other vaccination programs that we operate in the Western Cape. I don't have the page number there, but it is somewhere in Chapter 5, and so I just draw members' attention to that. Here it is. It's on page 147, figure 5.26. And so that, I think, is just another data point that you may want to consider when perhaps the committee does follow up, or the ad hoc committee follows up with the Department of Health in that respect. Member Nkondlo, you also raised the question around the number of jobs and youth unemployment. It is precisely those kind of questions we are hoping that the PERO itself will provoke by providing evidence that helps the development of policy through public debate. There are a range of programs that the province does have aimed at youth, and particularly youth not in education or training, so-called NEETs. There are programs in the violence prevention sector and so forth. I think where the executive will make determinations on further steps in the policy stance of the province will be outlined in the medium-term budget policy statement, and obviously in the final medium-term expenditure framework in March. That would be the extent to which there are modifications to these measures. I would say that I would provide a similar answer then, I think, on the question of informality and working and supporting the informal sector and its growth, given its importance and growing importance in the Western Cape economy. Let me stop there, and I will ask Dr. Haberman if he would like to add, and you may want to, particularly obviously on the broader structural drivers of growth in the global and regional economy, national and regional economy, but you may also want to just talk to specifically the questions of measures of inequality and development and the difference between the Gini coefficient and the HDI.
Thank you much, Chair, and thank you much, HOD. I mean, I think on the structural changes that are required in the economy, as I indicated, I think really the most important thing for the South African economy at the moment is to implement a series of reforms which will stimulate economic growth. And a key amongst those is naturally to improve two things. First is the supply of electricity, which I think has been a significant constraint on economic growth, particularly over the last 10 years. And secondly is to, particularly in the Western Cape, improve our links with the rest of the world to ensure that export growth can be supported and be taken forward. And I think the Western Cape government is, as I indicated, leading on a number of these initiatives, particularly around improving energy resilience and also improving logistics, particularly through the Port of Cape Town, working very closely there with Transnet. Those are two very simple, short-term, relatively short-term initiatives, which I think will also support a shift to areas that are more employment intensive and will naturally allow us to add additional jobs. I think this, particularly if you think about how employment intensive the agriculture sector can be in this province, just makes you realize that without those links to the rest of the world and without being able to export, it becomes very, very difficult. And we really need to find ways that we can grasp this huge post-COVID rebound and sort of grab it, I think, as a province and make sure that our goods and services are delivered. And that relates to both tourism and to agricultural exports, where we obviously are relatively strong. I think the other question relates to the various HDI measures. And obviously there are a number of different measures of inequality that you could look at. You could look at wealth inequality, income inequality, goods and services inequality. I think there's a huge range of literature on how you can go about thinking about this question in a little bit more detail. And obviously on the Human Development Index side, there are also a number of different ways that you can look at how well developed societies are and to what extent they are developing. The two most common ones, as you would know, is obviously the Gini coefficient, which looks at inequality, but it has got a number of different constraints related to it. And then on the HDI side, that's a relatively standard international measure. It is quite noticeable that if you look at one of the other measures, which is sort of an index of multi-dimensional poverty, the poverty rate has been declining and has been declining faster than the rest of the country, which is also one thing to take into account, although there are a number of different problems with pure poverty measures because they don't necessarily capture, there are different ways of measuring poverty. You can see whether or not people can have sufficient income to meet their basic needs, or food poverty measures, etc., etc. But there's also another way of thinking about how economic growth impacts on society, which is that naturally you want more and more people to simply be able to get out of poverty. And that can be quite complicated. There's a really interesting relationship between inequality and poverty, and sometimes, particularly during very fast growth periods, you may see poverty being reduced, but inequality rising. So it gets quite a complex way of trying to understand exactly where you are in the economy at the moment. That said, I mean, it's obvious, I think, that the more people that have jobs, the less poverty we will have. there's a direct link between jobs and reducing poverty. And that's why I think, these reforms, and I think the question is very well put, like how do we get, other countries have been able to realize these faster levels of economic growth. Surely we can. We have the workforce, we have the ability. There are just those things that we need to do.
Thank you, Minister.
Thank you. I want to just deal with a couple of issues. First of all, on the UK red list, there's obviously a great deal of I think, information and misinformation on this topic in the public domain. But the fact that South Africa remains on the UK red list is really a function of at least three elements. Concerns on the part of the British government about the prevalence of the beta variant, concerns about the efficacy of certain vaccines, particularly the AstraZeneca vaccine against the beta variant, and also concerns about the quality of our vaccine certification, quality of that documentation. I'm obviously very concerned about this. I have written to Liz Truss, the Foreign Secretary of the UK government, and made it very clear that we believe that the decision to keep South Africa on the red list is manifestly unfair, use those terms, and I requested that the decision be reviewed and that South Africa be removed from the UK red list. I've of course been in constant contact over the past couple of weeks, not only with the acting High Commissioner, but also with the Consul General UK government. We have obviously backed the SATSA campaign to get South Africa off the red list. And yesterday, I spent some time with Andrew Selous, who is the Prime Minister Boris Johnson's special envoy on trade to South Africa. And we had a very frank discussion about the fact that South Africa remains on the UK red list. I have to say that after all those various action steps, and also my conversation yesterday, I'm more optimistic now than I was that South Africa will indeed be removed from the UK red list at the next decision point, which I'm advised is on the 8th of October. So I'm more optimistic on this than on that South Africa will be removed from the UK red list. On the whole question of restrictions, I'm not sure if committee members are aware, but President Cyril Ramaphosa has in fact convened a presidential coordinating committee discussion, which I think commences in about an hour, where the president, the responsible national ministers, premiers and mayors will discuss the restrictions and the shifting to alert level 1. I'm reasonably optimistic based on the data, at least at our disposal, that there will be a decision to move to a level 1. But the point that I tried to make in my remarks was that I do think that given the data, that reverting to alert level 1, which would normally be where there would normally be a focus particularly on gatherings, on, for example, alcohol restrictions and curfew. I do think it's now time to go beyond that and look at other elements. A good example would be convention centers. I mean, it is simply, in my view, irrational that a large convention center, for example, the Cape Town Convention Center, which has not only a significant space under its control, but also has a very strong management team and the capacity to properly regulate the environment. It doesn't seem to me sensible that they would be restricted, for example, and I speak under correction here, to only have, for example, 250 people in that venue at a time. So it does seem to me that there's scope, for example, to take a look at the convention center space and really develop a set of measures which would allow that sector to open safely, of course, because that is vital to one aspect of the tourism sector which we possibly don't talk about often enough, and that would be the reigniting of business tourism, which is so important to the Western Cape. And I've raised this matter in various sort of intergovernmental fora, and there is, at least where ministers who are responsible for economic development are concerned, I think quite significant consensus on this kind of issue, for example. Then on the whole question of airlift, of course, airlift and connectivity is vital to the recovery of the tourism and hospitality sector. The outlook, I think we expect British Airways to resume flights in November. We expect United Airlines to resume in December. But a real bone of contention, of course, is the Delta Airlines matter, which I have raised on several occasions with the National Minister of Transport, but I have not yet had an adequate response. Again, on the matter of remote work, I mean, it seems to me that one of the measures that we ought to put in place is to develop a new visa regime which would allow for remote work, and particularly for long stay visas, which I think would enable the tourism sector, particularly in the Western Cape. Chair, we have to be competitive. Thailand have, which is, has recently, if I recall correctly, started issuing 10-year visas for certain categories of long stay tourists. And so I think we have to be competitive in this environment, and there is significant scope for, I think, visa reform in South Africa. Again, I've raised this matter with the National Minister. We've made a submission, and of course, it is not going to require a legislative change to implement a remote work or long stay visa. It requires simply a change. On your cyber attack question, I thought Transnet were obviously faced with an unprecedented crisis. And I thought in the main, they dealt with the crisis very well. But I think where they needed to be, let's say, sort of strengthened, would be in their communications, not only during the crisis, but actually after the crisis. And the fact is that we have not yet received a detailed explanation from the public entity as to what happened, or indeed, more importantly, what measures have been put in place to prevent a second cyber attack in the Port of Cape Town. And I, Chair, as you can imagine, will make it my business to make inquiries to get some assurance that measures have been put in place that will prevent the collapse of operations in the Port of Cape Town. I also want to deal with a question raised by the Honourable Nomin Kondlo, and that is the question that relates to the informal economy, and indeed to the PERO and how it impacts on policy and eventually the budget. Now, the data, I think, is very clear, and it was referred to and mentioned by the Honourable Member, where the informal economy grew at a faster rate than the formal economy and absorbed more labour. Well, so the data is clear, and we clearly, I think, need to do more in relation to the informal economy. Honourable Member is well aware of the various programs that we have implemented but I do agree, based on the data, that we have to do more. And I think that there are a couple of opportunities, and this would reflect my sort of preliminary thinking and some of the thinking in my department. We obviously have to understand much more fully the constraints on small and micro enterprises in the informal economy and how we can create that enabling environment for them to thrive. I think that there's also scope for us to expand our Pick and Pay program to other sectors, which are showing great potential in the informal township environment, particularly in relation to building materials. We've had some preliminary discussions on that. We've also, I think, a very exciting space for policy innovation in the informal township economy is how we leverage the buying power, particularly of the big retailers, in the informal economy. We have started, and I think I've mentioned this before to the honourable member, a set of preliminary conversations about how, with our big retailers, we might pilot developing a trading platform which would leverage the buying power of big retailers for informal and micro enterprises, smaller businesses in the informal economy. And finally, a new or another element which I think needs to be explored is how we use technology and alternative payment systems in order to allow banks to assess the credit worthiness of smaller businesses and micro enterprises, and possibly, based on the assessment, extend credit so that smaller.
Agenda from the Provincial Treasury for the committee is the first quarter, current financial year, first quarter expenditure performance report. We have a brief presentation for the committee that will just show, take the committee through the performance and non-financial and some aspects of non-financial performance for the provincial government as a whole. So I will hand over to Ms. Annelies Pick in that regard, and I think he will be ably supported by I think Ms. Zinat Ishmael from the Department of the Premier. Over to you, Ms. Pick.
Thank you, Chair. Good afternoon to all the members. I'm just waiting for the presentation to be flighted.
So do we need to put it, or you can... We did put it up, please.
I'll do so.
Thank you.
Yeah, I just want to make sure that the members can see the presentation.
Thanks. Colleagues, can you see the presentation online?
Yes, Chairperson.
Thank you. You can continue.
Thank you. So as the HUD has indicated, this is a brief report on the quarter one, both on the financial and the non-financial outcome of the 2021 financial year, the current budget we're currently implementing. And when we look at our expenditure, both from infrastructure and revenue, we have spent for the first quarter on average about 22.2% of our budget. And just for the members also to familiarize yourself with the table, the first section of the table indicates in terms of the main budget that we've tabled, but also for reporting purposes, and adjustments of rollover applications that have been approved at the national level on conditional grants have been included as part of reporting. And this is in terms of expenditure that the departments will incur as soon as the approval has been given to them. So that you'll see is what's in the adjustments column. So in total, we have spent expenditure of about 16 billion rand, and that, as I indicated, equates to 22.2% of our budget. As at the 30th of June for the first quarter, we were also showing in terms of some pressure. That was mainly in terms of the Department of Health to the value of about 54 million rand. And then the Department of Community Safety was showing in terms of an underspending of about 2.3 million rand. So when we look at in terms of some of the detail on that net over expenditure, so within health, as I indicated, the over expenditure was about 54 million rand, and that is mainly driven by the expenditure in terms of the third wave, and as well as anticipated the fourth wave and the current vaccination rollout for the program. So that is mainly in terms of program 2 in district health services, where health was showing pressure. Then in terms of community safety, the underspending of 2.3 million rand, that is really in terms of on the COE, in terms of some of the delays that they have in terms of filling their posts according to the recruitment plan. And then as I indicated, the adjustments for reporting purposes of the 216 million rand represents approved conditional grant rollovers, mainly within the Department of Education. And this is really in terms of, we're showing it as part of reporting because expenditure departments are incurring that, and they're incurring that expenditure in terms of the Direct Charges Act. And this rollover approvals will still be taken up as part of the adjustments budget. Then in terms of the expenditure reflected in terms of the first quarter, some of what is you won't see behind the numbers that is reflected is some of the risks that we as a province are carrying as we are implementing the 2021 budget. And one of the main risks is that now that we have a 2021 wage agreement in place, the funding of that wage agreement has not as yet been finalized at the national level. The impact for us as a province, so the additional cost of the wage agreement besides what we have budgeted for is about 1.4 billion rand. And this obviously is mainly found, the impact of it, with mainly 80% of that is within the Department of Health and the Department of Education that will incur most of the cost. Then in terms of the classification of the national disaster for drought on the 20th of July, that means that for us, there's certain part of our provinces that is impacted in terms of drought, and that is really in the Central Karoo district, parts of the Garden Route, and then also northern parts of the West Coast district, and that region therefore is still classified as a drought area. And so obviously in terms of what would happen is expenditure within the various departments to respond to the drought would require reprioritization within the current budget. And that's why it's also been indicated as a risk as at this stage. Then in terms of in education, at the time of reporting, we do understand that education finds themselves in terms of increasing trend of learner numbers and also unexpected number of learners this year, and that does also impact on the number of teachers that they require, but also on the infrastructure requirements that they need to respond to at the time of reporting. Then lastly, I mean, as you can see already in the first quarter of the financial year, health was showing that over expenditure of about 54 million rand, but further obviously going forward, and in terms of the rollout of the vaccination program, the impact and the costing of COVID-19 is having on health is also in terms of a risk that the department is carrying through the implementation. But particularly with the Department of Health, we as a province have submitted through the Provincial Treasury to the National Treasury an application for funding for the for the vaccination program. And then simultaneously, Health has also made an application through its sector department to the National Treasury for additional funding for the vaccination program. For that to be considered as part of the National Treasury's adjustments budget process, which they are currently undergoing. When we look at public entities, on average, public entities for the first quarter has spent about 23.5% of its budget of 784 million rand. And for the first quarter, underspending was projected underspending was shown by Cape Nature. And when we look at the reasons around in terms of the Cape Nature underspending at this stage, it's mainly in terms of compensation of employees. And then also in terms of some of the infrastructure projects classified as payments for capital assets. When we look at infrastructure now overall, as of the 30th of June, you'll see that we have on average spent for the current financial year for the first quarter 16.6% of our budget. And when we compare this to the previous first quarter of last year, then this was about 18% last year of budget. Nominally, it's almost on par, but in terms of percentage of budget is quite different. And the main reason is because as health was responding to COVID-19, also from an infrastructure perspective, you'll understand then for the first quarter for infrastructure, spending for health last year was higher than this year. And that's one of the main differences in terms of between the two different quarters. So when we look at the infrastructure pipeline, and this is a new graph that we are showing the committee, this is a pipeline that gives you an understanding in terms of mostly the construction projects that's happening in the current financial year. So out of the projects is about 589 projects. And the majority of those projects, about almost 50%, you'll see 49.6% of those projects are in preparation phase. Now, in terms of the in preparation phase, what that includes is the phase such as the project initiation, pre-feasibility, feasibility design, and the tender phase. So you can see majority of that is in the first quarter where the project finds itself. 39% of them is in construction. So most of that is in terms of carried over from the previous financial year. And so they're either in construction or they're in terms of practical completion or final completion. Then you also see that there is a category that is about 102 on the number of projects on the graph, and that is labeled as other COE and packaged. That is mainly the maintenance projects that's on the infrastructure pipeline, but that also then as non-infrastructure items includes projects around health technology, for example. So it is related to infrastructure, but it's not essentially in terms of a construction infrastructure project. So it gets packaged that way. And then also around the COE that health and education has around infrastructure is also packaged as non-infrastructure expenditure. So that is also included in the 102. But overall, you can see the majority of projects then finds itself then in the preparation phase of the infrastructure realm. And then in terms of our receipts, when we look at our receipts, this is divided into departmental owned receipts where we've received and collected about 514 million rand, which is about 20% of our own revenue budget. The second part of receipts, provincial receipts, is tax receipts, and this is our gambling and our horse racing receipts, and that amounts to about 177 million rand. And so overall, we have collected in terms of our provincial receipts about 692 million rand, which constitutes about 23% of our revenue at this stage. At this stage, and as time of reporting for Transport and Public Works, you'll see that with the data that they had available for the first quarter, they were projecting an under collection of revenue. Subsequently, with revenue collection increasing, I can indicate to the committee that they are no longer reflecting that under collection of revenue. So I mentioned already in terms of the two different kinds, the tax receipts and the departmental own revenue. Just some more information on the departmental own revenue on transport and public works. As we know, that is mainly in terms of your motor vehicle license fees, which collected for the first quarter about 272 million rand. And then the other major collection is in terms of the Department of Health, where we see a slight improvement when we compare that to the previous financial year, whereas they've now collected 112 million versus 102 million in the first quarter. I now hand over to Zenat Ismail, who's going to be taking you through the performance information. As Zenat.
Good afternoon, and can you hear? Thank you. So I will take all members through the context of the quarter release that we issue quarterly to all organizations, and that includes the Western Cape government departments and also the public entities. And it is a release that it is also been issued to Provincial Treasury that forms the content for also the cabinet submission that goes to that is presented on a cabinet level. So having said that, it is the quarter release actually presents the provincial non-financial performance data for Western Cape government, and that includes departments and public entity for the said quarter. These are validated performance data. There are two lenses as to how we look at the performance. Firstly, we provide a snapshot primarily on the overall performance in relation to quarterly targets. As we all know, that the annual performance plan is very much set on the targets that are planned and how we actually quarterly or perform against that particular targets. Secondly, emanating from last year, from COVID-19, we continue to provide a snapshot on the progress for the continued COVID-19 interventions, because there are interventions that actually started in 2021, and it actually still continuing in this current financial year. And there's also new COVID interventions implemented during this current financial year. There are two important points to note: that the data shared with the committee on the C19 interventions was collated via online survey and then incorporated into our quarterly performance reporting process, and the whole it is was done to standardize the manner in which we collect performance data on COVID-19 across all departments and across all public entities. Then the performance data was also validated by the HODs. Thank you. Next slide. Yes. So when one look a little closer to the performance data and look at the number of targets for this particular quarter that we are referring to, quarter one, there were 392 targets, of which 295 were achieved, and the number of partially achieved were 68, and the number of not achieved 29. But now I want to go into the latter three columns that actually talk about these targets achieved or partially achieved or not achieved in terms of percentages. So interesting to note, it is that the percentage of targets achieved is 75%, and partially achieved 17%, and not achieved 7%. And if one go look at the different clusters, and we, as you know, we cluster the departments according to the governance, social and economic, then one can see that the governance cluster continuously perform well above also the average of Western Cape government. Social in the social sector, one noticed that the Department of Social Development is the anomaly, where it's the only departments that have actually performed under 50%. And then one look at the Department of Health and Transport and Public Works that actually achieved below the 75% average for Western Cape government. Next. So this slide actually just shows that across 75% has been achieved in terms of just achieving targets, right? And then there are about, as I said, the 3 departments, notably under that 75% is then presented grammatically. Thank you. Similar story for the provincial entities in terms of the numbers. Number of targets 65, number achieved 50, number partially achieved 11, number not achieved 4. So when one talk about the latter 3 columns, and then one see 70 on average 77% of targets have been achieved. If 17% partially achieved, and then 7%, 5% not achieved. When one look at the different clusters, one can see in the social clusters, the liquor authority under the average, and also Casidra. Thank you. And this is just a schematic or a presentation of what I have communicated. Thank you. So this slide actually just kind of give us a little overview of overarching, or I would say overview of the reasons that influence performance, and mainly that influence performance in terms of when one cannot achieve a particular target. 2 lenses, the departments and the public entities. And these are the reasons given by departments. This incorrect target setting, which is common in planning. And we are at a time now where we have opportunity to actually correct this for the new planning cycle. Municipalities did not table or adopt their 2021-22 budget. Time adjustment to the submission of the annual report, pressure experienced due to wave 3, still COVID as a reason, reallocation of funding, sector responses, dependency on other stakeholders is a common reason, rescheduling of projects or project management, dependency of stakeholders, demand-driven indicators that are actually it's quite common, and it's actually, if one track the reasons for not performing or not reaching the targets, if one actually track the reasons quarter on quarter, those are actually very common reasons. From a public entity perspective, contractual delays with procurement, again COVID-19, invoice queries not resolving, resulting in late payment, budget and funding issues, quarter 1 data not received timelessly, and that is then the data management reason, and vacancies that not being filled. Thank you. Thank you. Next slide. So what we thought of sharing with the committee, it is when one look back, and one look back at quarter 1 in last financial year, and one compare to quarter 1 this financial year, then one noticed that in 2021, the average performance of Western Cape government, the departments, was sitting at 46%, and that was in the heart of COVID. And this quarter, it is 75%. And that is just for noting, and I'm not actually going into the reasons and the motivations and so forth. Public entities, 49% during quarter 1 for 2020/2021. This financial year, 77%. So just to give some context to it, when one look at the departments, interestingly to note, there were 392 targets recorded for quarter 1 last financial year and this financial year. So an aggregate 46% of targets were achieved during quarter 1 last year, while 75% of targets were achieved. So there's a kind of a percentage change or a difference of 29% if one look at last financial year and this financial year. Public entities, 59 targets were recorded in quarter 1 last financial year, 65 targets this financial year. So which means this financial year there's actually more targets that public entities are have planned. So on aggregate, there were 49% targets that was achieved during Q1, while 77% of targets achieved during this financial year. So a difference or percentage change in 28% of the targets. Thank you. When one look at COVID-19 interventions implemented, a total of 61 interventions were reported during Q1. Of that 61 interventions, 50 or 82% continued from 2021, which means it is been carried from 2021 and there is more than 1 year projects. So 11 or 18% of these interventions were newly implemented during Q1 by 5 departments. These departments were Economic Development, Department of the Premier, Transport and Public Works, DCAS, and also Agriculture. If one look at those departments, the MDDAT have actually implemented 7 new interventions, dealing from private non-health sector engagements related to the vaccine rollout program, regulatory interpretations, temporary employer relief scheme, as you know, the TERS, the enhanced expanding existing projects, COVID lockdown level 4 regulations, in terms of a survey of the tourism industry, business process optimization, and very much also tourist product development. And Department of the Premier, it dealt with a vaccine communication campaign. Transport and Public Works continues with quarantine and isolation facilities, conditional grants for community libraries, that's DCAS, and brand and producer grant support, Department of Agriculture. Thank you. And the next slide is actually showing just a little graph, but basically it is just a little snapshot of those 50 interventions, just to give an overview, just to give a context of those 50 interventions, to give some insight to the committee that 9 interventions were completed during Q1 and will not continue during Q2. 38 of these interventions will continue to Q2, and 2 interventions that were implemented were actually just deleted, and that is a kind of a data management issue there. So from the 11 new interventions implemented, 1 intervention implemented by DDAT was completed, so it will not continue more, and 10 interventions will continue. And in summary, overall, 10 interventions completed in Q1. We're still reporting on 49 interventions during Q2, and 2 interventions were removed due to data management errors. Thank you. Thank you. I hand back over to the HOD. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Pick and Ms. Ismail. Chairperson, that is then the Q1 report.
Thank you, colleagues, and thank you for the presentation. Hence, not on the report. Colleagues, I think a few questions from my side. One slide. Under the infrastructure spend, infrastructure expenditure, I think it's slide number 8 and then slide number 9 as well. The 9 billion or the 8.7 billion for the 2021 financial year, and then the 21-22 financial year, which is also 9 billion. Is that 589 projects on page slide? Is that, I'm trying to ask a question probably, would that be 589 projects and the combined is 17 billion? Is my understanding right? And is that projects all currently under construction, or should some of them still be tendered? Is it multi-year contracts? Doesn't make the question make sense, because 8.7 billion that's currently on the infrastructure expenditure for this financial year. Is it new projects? Are they currently under construction? And the 9 billion in next financial year, is that part of the 589 projects, or is it new projects that must still be tendered out? I'm just trying to understand that correctly. And then on one of the slides, I think it's slide number 20, on some of the reasons are COVID-19 pandemic and also under the department. To what extent does Treasury investigate the underlying reasons? Because I get it, not generally for the Western Cape, I just get a sense that the COVID-19 excuse, not necessarily here, but keeps being used. Is COVID-19, my daughter hit her knee, is COVID-19. To what extent do you investigate actually what is the underlying reasons for something not happening, and not just somebody saying, well, it's COVID-19? Thank you. Do I see any further hands? No, seems to be no questions further. I hand over to you.
Thank you, Chairperson. So infrastructure investments, in relation to your first question, has very long lead times, and projects go through a cycle of preparation and execution, and then obviously the service delivery side and renewal and maintenance and so forth. So there's an asset management cycle as well, which starts with for a new investment, just the idea of what it is we need to invest in, and then a staged program of preparation of that project to make sure that it is what they call shovel ready. It goes through a series of stage gates. So the numbers that you are seeing. So we will have projects, and we do have projects in our pipeline that are at all stages, from stages of preparation to stages of execution. Right across the province and in all the different sectors and so forth. So the numbers that you are seeing are the estimates of expenditure on those projects. That's the 9 billion a year, and there'll be some where it is still in the preparation phase, and there's some that are in execution phase. One of the things that we introduced in the 2021 medium-term expenditure framework was greater support for actually the preparation phase, because that helps to improve the quality of the implementation phase spending. But the figures that you're seeing, particularly in the outer years, may be the continuation of a project that's going to, with infrastructure, you don't snap your fingers and it's suddenly created. So there will be multi-year projects in there. When you look at the 589 projects that are identified in the pipeline, that doesn't include what we call packaged projects, where you take a more programmatic approach to a lot of smaller projects. So depending, it gets to some quite technical definitions with the engineers on what constitutes a program, what constitutes a project, and so forth. But this is the sort of best insight that we can give to the committee on the quarterly basis here. What I would point the committee towards is our annual publication as part of the MTF documentation, which is the overview of provincial and municipal infrastructure investment, which starts to give you really quite granular and spatialized data on what projects are where in the framework. So I hope that answers your question. It actually captures various stages of projects with both preparation and execution, and many, but not all of those projects will be multi-year projects where they'll incur expenditure across the whole 3 years, and in some cases even beyond that if it's a particularly complicated project. On COVID-19 expenditures, we do investigate. We don't. COVID-19, it can't just be a get out of jail free card. Of course not. But I think that we are really quite well aware of the multifaceted nature of the disruption that COVID-19 has brought. And the fact that in some cases that's ongoing. So, it's the most obvious case would be in our Department of Health, and that's what's everyone on focus on. They need to remain agile and so on and so on. But but actually the effects are far broader than that. It's not a health disaster, it's a national disaster. The effects are seen in some of our entities, like in terms of Cape Nature, having to adjust course no part of public expenditure has been left unturned and unchanged by the pandemic, and all of our systems have also been disrupted in sometimes very unpredictable ways and continue to be disrupted. I think it speaks to the resilience of the Western Cape government that we haven't had more widespread disruption in this. But the Treasury does certainly not take it as face value. We do, our teams will ask questions, explain why that is COVID-19. Is there not another explanation for it? Because ultimately, we want to work with departments to execute the expenditures, to enable them to execute the expenditures, and diagnosing the problem incorrectly is not going to help. I have seen on the progress there, it's actually been quite good. We're not across the line yet in terms of being able to provide reliable information, because remember, a lot of the explanation of what the variances might be really does need to come from the project owners. And so we've got to still get those systems aligned, and it is being done on an electronic platform, on a digital platform, which I think is going to offer a lot of the answers that you're looking for that just almost real-time, more textured information in the future. I would have to find out from colleagues, and maybe they can comment around what the timelines are for that with national, because it's a common national platform that we've been helping to develop.
Thank you. I just saw Member Kondlo's hand went up.
No, thank you, Chair. I think just one question. I think staying with this conversation on infrastructure, I'm not sure as part of the economic recovery, the extent to which one may be going into that sort of report HOD you're referring to, where the projects are at. But I think one is always trying to find where one can be able to pick up what happens in as far as new assets, especially if we talk about what we are just debating in the PERO as it relates to the opportunity in the informal sector, both for jobs and actually productivity in terms of new enterprises. Because one of the things that one is looking at is the extent to which, in terms of what we are prioritizing, that there is a sort of appetite or already decisions about new infrastructure, in particular that supports those that are in those informal sectors, if indeed there is even some kind of GISing of where those projects are, so that one can be able to benefit from it in terms of gaining more of the skills and also the jobs that could actually be sprung out of those projects. Now, what I'm trying to check is that would one, as you are starting to work in terms of trying to put more granular information, would one be able to see exactly where those projects are at, and also in the conversation on infrastructure and the pipeline, is there a conversation on really building in, the new assets in the areas, in particular that service in informal sector? Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. That is the last, and then we'll conclude with the department.
Absolutely, the spatial location of the assets is definitely part of the architecture that's being developed, and I've seen some early results on it, and it's very useful, and it has the potential also to overlay with both national investments and with municipal level investments, because ultimately the citizen sees just one government there to provide these services. So that GIS dimension is a very, very fundamental part of what is being constructed. And in terms of the sectors and whether the assets support particularly the informal sector, I think that that is both a question of budget analysis. What's the relative investment between, say, a large school investment that small contractors may not be able to take on by themselves? The specification or the procurement modality. Does a large contractor bring in smaller contractors that have informal workers who can do certain tasks and so forth? But also the design of the assets as well. Are we designing assets that are useful, public assets that are useful to the informal sector? In terms of how we are designing roads, verges, and so forth. So it's a kind of multifaceted and not purely a budget question, which is why we don't want to de-link the projects themselves from the discussions with the departments, because we think it's very important to have that in an integrated way. But obviously from the provincial treasury side, we want to make sure that we are resourcing the debate with the fiscal information and with as much other information as we can, so that those policy issues can really be focused on. And so that is where the infrastructure reporting module is heading. I very much hope that it will get to a level of maturity quite quickly where it can be placed confidently in the public domain. As well, but I can't speak. That would be a subject of a national timelines, so I can't make any commitments in that respect. But I'm sure that our colleagues in National Treasury would share that ambition ultimately.
Thank you very much, Mr. Sedlich and your team and your online team. Thank you for coming through to the standing committee this morning. We really appreciate it, and we're looking forward to seeing you in the next round in the medium-term budget policy statement. You're now excused. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Chair.
Colleagues, we just stay behind.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Ms. Ismail. There's your voice.
Thank you.
Colleagues, if we can just, members, we can just stay behind just to finish our administration. You did receive the minutes of the previous meeting. In the 3 minutes we need to adopt, when my chief was chairing. We were all present at those meetings. Thanks. We're first going to adopt the draft report. If you can just, Wasima, which one are you putting up first?
Chair, we can do what you want us to do. The draft report, Lizette.
Okay, let's do the budget committee workshop. That's fine. Whatever was we'll do it. Whatever you got on the screen, we'll do that. It's fine.
Lizette, sorry, man.
That's it. No matter which order, it's fine.
She's making you like a timaka.
That don't make people democrat. It's not Friday yet. Colleagues, that was the budget committee workshop that we had on the 21st of May at 8 o'clock. Let's make sure that, first of all, attendance. I was there. Make sure your name is there if you were there.
Sorry, Chairperson, Lizette, it's the 21st of July.
Yes, that's the 21st of July, yes. So let's go down, page number 2. Please check the spelling of your name and surname. Thank you. If we can, that's page 3. That was the full reflection of the meeting. If we can have somebody to propose for this minutes for adoption, please. Colleagues, can you hear me? Colleagues, can you hear me?
I can hear you, Chair.
Okay.
Loud and clear, Chair.
Speak if you
Yes,
can.
we can hear you, Chair.
Side there, yeah. I'm the only one here.
I second the proposal, Chair.
Okay, thank you. Member Philander proposed and Member America second. Can we go put up the next documents, please? That was the meeting 20th of July, page 1. Go down, okay. That's a true reflection of what took place on the day. Can I have a proposal, please? Member Philander? Member Philander, I can't hear you.
Moving that we adopt, Chairperson.
Thank you. Please unmute yourself when you speak, colleagues. Can I have a second to that, please?
I second that, Chair.
Thank you, Member America. Can we do the third document, please? This was the Budget Committee workshop on the 22nd of July. Go down, please. Okay, just go down to the resolutions. This increase. That's a true reflection of what we agreed to. Can I have a proposal, please?
Move for adoption, Chair.
Thank you, Member Philander. Who else?
I support, Chair.
America. Thank you. Can we go to the next document, please? Budget Committee on Friday, the 23rd of July, page 1. Page 2. That's fine. That's a true reflection of what happened there. Can we have a summary to adopt this minutes, please?
Move to adopt, Chairperson.
Thank you, Member Philander. A seconder.
Seconded, Chair.
Thank you, Member America. Thank you, colleagues. This is the our draft committee report for today. I'll read it out to you. That the Budget Committee, having considered the Provincial Economic Review Outlook of 2021, PR 261/2021, dated the 30th of September, which is today. The Budget Committee reports that it convened on the 30th of September 2021, which is today, and concluded its deliberations on the Western Cape Government Provincial Economic Outlook, Review and Outlook 2021, PR 261/2021 referred to it. Yes, that's a true reflection of what happened today. Can we have someone to adopt this, please?
Move to adopt, Chairperson.
Thank you, Member Philander. Can I have a seconder, please?
Support, Chair. America.
Thank you, Member America. That becomes an official document of this Budget Committee of today. As far as I know, I've covered everything that needed to be covered here.
Yes, Chairperson, you've adopted all committee documents.
Thank you to Wasima, Lizette, all our colleagues in the House. I'm the only one actually here today. Siraj, I think was here, he's on hold, but he's at the back here. Masinte, thank you for your help. Thank you everybody to make this meeting happen today. Candice Morris, and thank you to all the members of the Standing Committee for the productive engagement today. This meeting is adjourned. Have a lovely day further.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you,
Bye.
Chair.